Welcome to Killer Psychologists. Today we are going to explore the psychological triggers or tipping points that drive individuals to commit heinous acts of violence. This conversation comes following the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. On July 13, 2024, 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks attempted to assassinate 78-year-old Donald Trump, the former president of the United States. At the time, Trump was the Republican nominee for the upcoming presidential election, addressing a crowd in Butler, Pennsylvania. In a chilling turn of events, Matthew Crooks fired 8 rounds into the crowd, grazing Trump's right ear and tragically killing a spectator in the crowd, a 50-year-old volunteer fire chief, and he critically injured 2 others. A Secret Service sniper returned fire, and Crooks was killed on scene. The headlines following this incident indicated that authorities were uncertain of Crooks' motive, and they're continuing to investigate by going through his phone and computer to see what digital footprint he left behind to find out more about his state of mind leading up to the event. Now, as forensic psychologists, we are retained not only to interview killers, but sometimes the deceased to evaluate and perform a psychological autopsy, an attempt to understand what an individual was thinking and feeling leading up to their death based on psychological factors. So today we're going to discuss the potential psychological state of Matthew Crooks, the would-be assassin, and the complex interplay of factors. Now, records indicate that Crooks conducted an online research on previous mass shootings showing an interest or perhaps a disturbing fascination with notorious predators like Michigan high school shooter Ethan Crumbley. His online research also revealed that he potentially was looking for information on how to build explosives. So that shows that perhaps a planning of premeditation beyond maybe what was allegedly thought of at first being a spontaneous act of violence. So we want to have this discussion. What causes this, someone like this who is said to be quiet and a loner? So what pushes someone from this realm of ordinary into the abyss of extraordinary violence? So today we're going to decipher the thought process behind not only this recent assassination attempt, but others like it. So as we know, Crooks was described by many as quiet or a loner, but did this social isolation play a role? Authorities say he searched for information online about depressive disorder and seeking treatment. So was he having some sort of internal turmoil? What are we missing here? What more can we know about him? I don't think that we've heard from his father or family. I don't know that they've made a public statement yet. More is being investigated. Investigators say they found little evidence about political or ideological motives. So are they suggesting that this attack was driven more by personal grievances or a need for recognition? So today I have 2 distinguished forensic psychologists. Dr. Graham Danzer is with us here today. He's published dozens of peer-reviewed articles, and he's presented at dozens of conferences. He has over 18 years of clinical experience specializing in risk assessment and psychopathy. And also we have Dr. Craig Wetterer here today with us. And so together, I want to ask you guys some questions that will help us examine the mind of this individual, exploring his motives and his history, and discuss some of the signs that perhaps go unnoticed. So to start, I'm going to pose a question. What are some of the common early warning signs or psychological traits or triggers that often present in individuals who commit these types of crimes?
Craig, did you want to go first, or I go?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think to answer this question, there's a number. I mean, it really depends on context, setting, and like the individual differences are varied. But I think there are some common factors, and Dr. Danzer can certainly chime in on this, because with your extensive experience and research background, you're going to be able to contribute quite a bit here. But from my experience in the individuals that I've evaluated, particularly people who are vulnerable for enacting violence on others, some of the common things I see are social isolation and withdrawal. So there's events or things that are happening in an individual's life, whether they're ostracized, whether they're bullied, or whether they feel they've been disconnected or they've been in some way alienated from the larger society. These are things that I see repeatedly, and I think the research also does show that these variables are things that we need to look at very carefully, because when individuals get when they get socially cast out, when they feel alienated, when they feel their belongingness becomes thwarted in a way, this can lead to a couple of things. It can lead to internal distress where someone becomes suicidal, right? So there's an internalizing problem there. But where we have that intersection of violence is when we have folks who have both the internalizing, but they also have externalizing behavioral problems and characteristics. In other words, they have that either that antisocial element that's present in the personality architecture, or perhaps even traits of psychopathy that underlay that. So when you put those together, I think that creates that recipe, so to speak, for the potential for violence. So those are some of the common things that I see. Dr. Danzer is probably going to be able to elucidate a lot more on this than I have.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing. A lot of just the kind of reading that I've been doing lately for my own kind of betterment in the area was related to terrorism and what essentially gets people not only to kind of sympathize with what most of us would consider really extreme and really kind of countercultural beliefs, the ideas of doing what we would consider to be really terrible things to a lot of people without any kind of clear there's not. It would be hard to beyond superficially really understand why they would do something like that. And as Dana had mentioned, I think that arguably the most important part is what gets people over the edge. Where they're not just thinking about things, they're not just talking about it, they're not just chatting about it. Maybe not even kind of threatening it, but they actually have gotten to the point where they're further along the pathway to violence. They're preparing. I'm thinking about the insider threat literature that talks about how there becomes a kind of probing of security systems, testing, planning things out, trying to kind of map out what's going on, figuring out, am I going to come after a hard target? Am I going to come after a softer target? And, that's, I would argue that's really the big question that, us eggheads really have got to figure out, when do people get to that edge? And the obvious next kind of piece is how do we get them off of there? And I think part of the challenge is that we only have so much predictive accuracy. We're incrementally better. A really good argument that's in the literature is, well, if we weren't involved in trying to figure this out, it would essentially be left to the courts and law enforcement. And arguably they came to us in the beginning, not the other way around. It's the same thing kind of, related to the military and law enforcement that were involved in selection, because the kind of word of mouth and the good old boy network doesn't always generate the kind of accuracy and good predictions that you would want. I mean, we do have an incremental addition. We don't always get it right, but we do add value to that discussion. And I guess where I'm really kind of going with this whole bigger picture is, and I think Dana talked about this, but was there something that got missed? In these kind of cases, were there warning signs that people didn't pick up on, maybe rationalized? And part of the challenge though is that there's so much of this that happens in an everyday kind of normal life, right? There's the terrorism literature talks about how that a lot of the times when people do these kind of terrible things, it's a younger, as Craig said, alienated, often white male that's 18, 20 years old, something like that, kind of awkward, a little bit, disaffected from society. But the problem is there's a lot of them out there. But I think kind of the call to action in this is that the numbers have gone way up. In the last few years, there's been way more of these kind of incidents. And it's been consistently, if I remember right, I think from 2022 or so up to or maybe 2020, every year there's been, I think it's been over 600 of these kind of mass shootings. So something is happening, and it's not just the one case. It's becoming more. It's threatening to become normal.
Yeah, wow, that's great points. I mean, just excellent. And when you speak to, you were speaking about, our value add in terms of what we can do as forensic psychologists when we're assessing for the risk of violence. I think the audience needs to know that there are these limitations in what we can do. We use tools, we don't, like structured professional judgment tools, and we use probability-based instruments, right? Tools that can give us a probability estimate of whether someone's going to be violent, but that's looking at the averages, so it's not laser focused, right? So we can certainly help the court. We can help people understand like who might be at risk for this, for escalating towards violence. But we just don't have that 100% accuracy. And you're right, it's hard to figure out because there's lots of socially awkward, guys that are out there that are, in fact, I read some literature recently that, there's this sort of effectiveness that's happening across young males today, where they're not getting into relationships, they're choosing, just to be single. And so I think there's these larger shifts happening in the general population as well. And I don't know how that all fits in, but there's another interesting thing, because I do a lot of research in suicidology, and that's kind of my line of research is kind of moving towards, looking at assessing for suicide risk. But again, we see the intersection of this as well, where we're seeing, suicide rates or base rates in suicide in some of these groups are also increasing. There was a little dip during the pandemic in the overall rate of suicide, but now we're starting to see the general trend is back up again, and it's going up much higher in certain segments of the population. Some of the younger folks are increasing. We're seeing increasing suicidality, and so again, when you have that, yes, that's anger in or internalized, turning towards the self. But where it gets dangerous is when you have both, where you have somebody who is both suicidal and then again they're homicidal at the same time. Again, this being disconnected, being alienated, ostracized, bullied, those sorts of things seem to be common factors that drive a lot of these single shooter, not the radicalized. When we're talking about the radicalized people who are joining sort of movements, terrorist movements and such, I think there's a different psychology in that, but again, it's where it's hard to figure out out of the group, like you said, there's this guy is going about his way. He has got an AA degree. He was apparently working. He had a good job. He didn't appear to have anything going on that people were noticing that was suggesting there were any problems. But that's the same thing that we see a lot of times with suicide. It's we see a lot of concealing behaviors, and we don't see the until it's too late, and then it's like, how did that happen, right? And so people are always like shocked, like, well, how did this guy do? Why did this guy do this?
Yeah. No, that's true. It's I don't know that I have really strong science to go off of this. This may be more of kind of my own moral input here, but I so often find it really hard to believe that there really was, it's hard to believe that there was nothing that nobody saw and then it just happened. I mean, it's not the same thing, but like I've worked in a lot of controlled environments, and when bad things happen, that's a lot of the time the kind of water cooler talk as well. It's nobody's fault. This just kind of stuff just happens here. And, this is probably just my own kind of personal reaction. It's probably not my science, but I have a hard time with that, that there's nothing that we could do. I mean, it's kind of putting ourselves as people and psychologists and helpers and, kind of visionaries for making the world better in a pretty lousy place, that we are really that. Are we blind? Do we not get it? Are we kind of,
Yeah.
are we, I mean, people, sometimes when you testify, there's kind of a cross-examination along the lines of, well, there's a lot you guys don't know. And it's like, well, there's a lot that we do know. And there's a lot about people that's just kind of part of the great mystery, so to speak. But, at the same time, there's enough that we know that I find it hard to believe that there was nothing that anybody could have seen, heard, done, and so forth. But part of the problem that we have is it's hard to measure those cases where nothing happened. All the great preventative kind of work. The times that law enforcement goes out and stops something terrible from happening, and there's no way to measure it. You don't know that there could have been another murder there if not for somebody showing up and doing their job. And I don't know where that leaves us, but I do have a lot of hope for our field on the whole. That there's got to be a way that we can contribute to the growing knowledge and service of this kind of stuff, not continuing to happen at 600 a year, because it used to happen at 300 a year. So it's definitely possible to be less. It's only been since 2020. So, how do we get it back down again? Because it's becoming more common. And, like you had said, also I'm thinking of the Las Vegas shooting that happened where it didn't seem like there was from what I remember, there was not a great theory of what happened. There was just a lot of, kind of shrugging.
Are you talking about Anthony Polito?
No,
the UNLV shooter?
This is the you're talking about the Harvest Festival shooting that where like 54 people were killed, right? Is that the shooting you're referring to?
Yeah, I can't remember the name, but the guy in Vegas who had the really big shooting, and there was, as I remember, no real clear kind of nailing down exactly what happened. I'm thinking in comparison, like people knew what happened with Dylann Roof, or the guy in Buffalo. That was pretty. There weren't any. It wasn't that hard to kind of put the whole picture together with some error in either direction. But generally people got it pretty good and pretty quickly. But I just maybe it's out of kind of ambition for our field, but I think we can somehow get it right more often. Well, I think so.
I've got to ask you this question because I guess I think of our last cast, our podcast last week, which is, the future of prediction, the future of the science of violence risk, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about predicting risk of violence, and I don't know what, we, like I said before, we have actuarial based tools that we will use that are certainly, they give us this incremental, increase in validity in terms of our predictive validity, but they're not perfect by any means. And I'm sure they've stopped a lot of, individuals from, engaging in violence because those individuals have been appropriately, locked up. But I'm wondering, again, as AI technologies emerge, what might that look like in the future? Because they're already talking about, using large language models to model suicide prediction, and they're looking at, again, this is all very new, but I'm wondering if this is going to be translational to the science of violence prediction in the future.
Yeah.
kind of like Minority Report in a certain way.
Mm.
If anyone remembers the movie with Tom Cruise, which again, that was the futuristic, where they're predicting, someone's criminal conduct and behavior based on all of this I don't think they were calling it AI at that time, but technology essentially.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just it's not the same thing, but I know that they're doing similar things in threat assessment, where with insider threat cases, because there's just such an enormous amount of online information they have to go through. They have different kind of software programs that part of the problem they have right now is that it's kind of like a car alarm. It pings at a very low level, and so you come into your desk and you've got this enormous volume of information to go through, and it's too much. The call to action that I see in there for us is that the balance between sensitivity and specificity has got to come from us. There's a part of this that a machine is not going to be able to do, and probably I'm not a real technology expert, but I would expect that if the three of us were looking at an online conversation that had that point of no return, like I have to do this, there's no turning back, see what you've made me do kind of thing. I think we would pick up on tone in a way that I don't believe a machine can. I don't believe it. And, I could be proven wrong. If there's another technology expert coming on here and saying, well, let me set your record straight, I'll concede. But, there's a part of that where you sit down with people and you get a feel for them. And, like you said, there's going to be a limitation to how predictive you can be. But the alternative is to essentially go back to the 1900s. And if that was working, there wouldn't have been so much legislation. We wouldn't all be working, and we wouldn't be called upon so often. It would be, it would surprise me very much if there were a room full of judges that really wanted to make decisions related to violence risk prediction, kind of civil commitment for sex offenders, competency to stand trial without us. I would be really, that there's a way that we still have a long way to go, but I think the most important part is that we make that margin of error, I would argue, lower on the whole. There's bad work that happens, but there's a lot of really good work, and the kind of the alternative that makes the work really needing to keep going on is that we could, of course, just say, well, look, violence has a very low base rate. If we release every violent person right now from prison, most of them will, most days they will not be violent. Murder is the least recidivated crime. Right. But the issue is that we've decided as a society that we're not willing to accept that kind of, numbers game. We're not going to say, well, murder doesn't happen very often, so we're going to deprioritize it. It's so egregious that we're not morally comfortable with that. And that's the kind of society that we're living in. But we've got to somehow get that tipping point that Dana talked about. I mean, that's got to be our call to action. Like, when are people up at the mountaintop, and when are they on the edge? And at the point where that would really be the right time for a more kind of urgent action. But it's like you said, it's very hard to get there because there's so much difficulty in what is somebody going to do next, right?
Yeah, this reminds me as you talk about this, about if you recall the Elliot Rodger case this was back in 2014 down in Goleta, which was Santa Barbara County. Elliot Rodger was this again disaffiliated, and he was rejected by women. He was socially awkward. I believe he had even been diagnosed with a pervasive developmental disorder at some point in his life. So this is a guy, I see some similarities in him and Crooks. And he went and he went on a shooting spree, and he was randomly targeting people. And he killed several, I believe. I don't remember exactly how many he killed. But what's interesting about him is that there were some warning signs there that again weren't paid attention to by friends, family, and such. And I believe he posted a manifesto at some point, and he went online and made some statements prior to even engaging in these acts, and ended up going out and doing what he did, and he ended up I believe either suicided. I think he committed suicide at the very end before the law enforcement was able to catch him. But, again, it goes back to, like, for someone like that, could have we done, could have we intervened at some point, had we had, had that information been made available. And again, sometimes that requires, we have to be made, this information has to be made available to us, the experts, so that we can evaluate, right? We can evaluate the, this threat and this potential risk. And like you said, I worked in law enforcement for 28 years, and retired or left several years ago, and they were just starting to do this type of threat assessment that you're talking about. Now they have entire units in a lot of agencies that actually that's their job, is to go through social media for people who they believe might pose a threat to either political figures or other people, and they're having to go through all this vast data. And so what variables, I mean, I think that's the issue too. It's like, what variables are really the predictors, the number, these predictors that we know, we would throw it in a regression model and say, this is the number one predictor, this explains the most variance in violent outcome versus this, and so on. That's what we really kind of need to be doing more of. And I don't see that yet, in terms of and I'm wondering about your research and whether you've, been involved in any of that, or if you've seen any research ongoing that's really trying to look at it that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, you're right to think of it like a stepwise kind of regression equation where, you can figure out, almost a sense of trying to put together it's not exactly the same thing, but, like when I've done a really good malingering assessment, what I've essentially kind of said is, here are the aspects of the person's history that correspond to the items on the test. So, essentially, not to be flippant, but if you're somebody who really needs math to explain things, here it is. But, what the test is essentially showing you is a mathematical representation that the person presents much differently when a psychologist or court authority is in the room. That they present much more impaired when criminal proceeding stakes are much higher. And yes, the test will tell you something, but the integration and putting things together so that other people without the expertise will understand it is a human factor that I don't think a machine is going to put us out of work in relation to. But I think you were right to bring that in earlier. There has to be some way of combining our intelligence with that which is non-human, because there's too much data out there for any of us to do the whole thing. We can't do it. And when we try, there's all this uncontrolled variance out there. Especially with those really isolated cases where there's probably not that much data on them. There's maybe a family member, a friend that talks to them a lot, but I'm thinking personally, I would feel like such a betraying friend to call the authorities on somebody I was close to because I was worried to call I would pride myself on being an upstander type. I would not like to think that I would look the other way, but as I'm thinking about possibly, whistleblowing on somebody that I really loved, that would feel like an awful betrayal. That would be so hard for me. And I don't know. It just makes me think, maybe a big, is there some way that we can contribute to upstanding being okay? It's not, because I'm sure I'm not the only person that would feel like a betrayer in doing that. How do we make that okay? To say, look, I'm not getting this person in trouble. I'm trying to possibly save them from themselves, because if I don't call, no one else will. And I don't like the idea, well, it's not my problem. Well, it is my problem. I don't want to have something like this happen and feel like, shit, there's something I could have done here. I don't know. How do we do that? How do we make it okay to call for help, even if the other person doesn't want us to? And, maybe people say, well, it's not my business. Well, but there's 600 of these now instead of 300. So maybe it's becoming all of our business. Maybe it's time for the village to start raising the children again. I don't know.
Well, I would like to comment on that because I looked at some stats, and a lot of people have knowledge about things that are going to happen, like especially if it's in your own family and they're not reporting it. Okay, we know this.
Yeah.
And we know this. Craig and I know this of working inpatient, doing suicidal, homicidal interventions, talking to family, and getting the picture later on. And they always start out saying, minimizing, downplaying a lot of things, not revealing, not telling you. Over time, they'll tell you more and more. And then you realize, wow, there was a lot going on. So it says in 4 out of 5 school shootings, at least one other person had knowledge of the attacker's plan but failed to report it. Another statistic is almost all mass school shooters shared threatening or concerning messages or images. More than 75% raised concern from others prior to the attacks. Bystanders saw the warning signs and didn't report it, right? And actually, I'll say this also. I was on TikTok the other day. I don't know, looking at conspiracy theories around this case. But there was, I know, there was a threat. Someone made a threat and somebody to kill someone. Okay, so this lady was talking about it. So I thought I would pause and watch this video. And someone said, well, isn't it your responsibility to report this? And she made a whole nother video saying, hell no. How's it my responsibility? And it went on and on. And I looked at the comments and everyone said, it isn't her responsibility to report this. And I was alarmed because is this the general census? The we see this and we don't respond or act. And it was there were some mixed opinions, but feel free to share your thoughts on that.
Well, this is one of my students many years ago did a study on bystander effects and diffusion of responsibility, which is a social psychological construct that I think is at play here. And I think might explain in part why we see these situations where people don't report these things. It's this sort of, and again, this is a diffusion of responsibility, just has to do with like, it's somebody else's problem. Somebody else will report it. Somebody else, will do this. And we see this bystander effect happening in situations, and we're seeing more instances of this now that we have all this social media and people live stream everything all over the place. So when people are being robbed or attacked in subways, you got these people standing around and doing nothing. Okay, that's what explains. It's a social psychological phenomena where people look at this and they're like, well, there's other people here, so I'm not necessarily going to take the responsibility. I'm not going to jump into this. I'm not going to report this. And so I think in part that could explain what we're seeing. But I think there's a decay in the social fabric happening just generally in the country. And I hate to say that, but and having worked in law enforcement, and I'm still connected to law enforcement pretty intimately. I train police officers in crisis negotiation tactics, working with people with severe mental illness and that kind of stuff. And I hear these reports, from all these agencies all across, the state of California that just this degradation, this overall, societal sort of degradation that seems to be occurring is very concerning across the board. So I think there's a lot of things that are going into this. Why we're not seeing people take responsibility and go, you know what, I'm going to do something about this because this person is definitely going off. They're likely going off the rails here, and I need to let law enforcement know or let somebody know, right? I don't know. I don't know how much science is behind what I just said, but I do know that there's social psychological phenomenon that probably explain this in part. And it seems like it's becoming more, I don't know, 30 years ago, someone being attacked randomly, in a public setting, if there's other people around, there would have been more intervention right at that level without just saying, call the police or somebody picking up a phone and recording it. Versus actually like trying to intervene or help the victim, right? I mean, we see instances of this happening quite frequently now, and I don't know that we saw it to that degree 30 years ago. We didn't have cell phones that we didn't have smartphones 30 years ago either. But but that's kind of my take on that. I think there's a lot going on here that explains why these things are happening, why they're increasing. But then it goes back to the question, like, what do we do about this? Like, how do
Yeah.
we intervene, like, as professionals, and what can we contribute to try to, stop this trend? Because like you said, it's definitely getting worse. It's definitely getting
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah. I, I've thought of it. It's going to say, I'm not changing the subject, but like when I've worked in settings with prisoners, I mean, part of the problem that you have in institutional settings is there's much more reward for antisocial than pro-social behavior. And it's difficult to make behavior change based on principle or ideology. This is the right thing to do because that's a point of view. And I'd complain to my folks about this sometimes is, it's difficult. How do you get people to buy into society again? The idea of things that I think most of us would still find a value in and of themselves, like to, probably have some kind of a long-term relationship, to be, familially connected, to work. And, there's large segments of inmate populations that I'm not sure have that in entirety. There's no buy-in. And, like you said, this is probably coming from my own kind of personal kind of view rather than anything scientific, but there's it seems to me like there's a need for, if I'm going to do this, what's in it for me? And I don't know. I don't know if that was as much the case before as now, but it's like, when I go to work and I do a good job, I don't do it because I want more money. I do it because, I value being a psychologist. I believe in the mission of being a psychologist. I want the world to be better than the way I found it. And somehow, I mean, that's where you make the 911 call, I think, but if I don't know how you build that in the people that don't have that. How do you, essentially kind of almost create more altruism rather than, well, if I've got a bad feeling about this person, they're doing something that really makes me nervous, and I wasn't born yesterday, so it bothers the hell out of me, and I know something's wrong, but I'm not going to get involved because that's more difficult and stressful and uncomfortable and problematic than continuing to walk. And it may just be my limit as a psychologist. I don't know how you get people out of that. I mean, I've tried, I've tried with students, that the ones who they're like, look, I want to go to school. I want to get a degree. I want to make more money. It's hard to create more value for education in and of itself. Like when I'm reading, I want to learn and I want to know more so that I'm a better psychologist. You don't have to reward me with, peanuts and carrots. I don't know how you do that, but maybe that's another something that we, how do we get people to have value for that kind of stuff by itself without, cash and prizes, to do a good job, not because I want more from my boss, but because I want more from myself.
Right. And yeah, exactly. So let's think about this from the perspective of, let's look at another culture, another country that has high gun ownership. So just as an illustration, as maybe a thought experiment, in Switzerland is a little homogeneous, and in turn it's not as heterogeneous as the United States is, but it's definitely a different culture. Europe has a different culture. So why do we not see similar patterns, in countries that have high gun ownership, that have, in fact, most, men of age, military age, are required to actually have a firearm or be ready because they have their own militia there. It's not, they don't have a formal military. So that speaks to the issue of just culture in and of itself. We're talking about the culture here in the United States, right? And so I think there's unfortunately there's this, it's the individualistic, elements of our culture, because, we are individualistic here, in the United States. And, but I think it's gotten to a level now where it like you just said, you've got this. If this doesn't add value to me individually, if it's, there's got to be something, some incentive for me here, before I'm going to take any action or do anything. Otherwise, I'm not doing it, right? And
yeah,
me,
it's kind of a mean way to say it, but it's like, put some, throw me a piece of beef jerky and I'll jump
you're
up,
right.
I'll do a trick, and it's, I don't, yeah, I don't. I mean, I get it on some level, that there has to be reinforcements, and we're all vulnerable to them. Before Skinner passed away, he was really pissed at the APA convention. I mean, he was going off the rails about how people really had it wrong to get away from the pigeon view of people. Look, listen, you can get people to do things via reinforcements, and it's a deterministic way to look at mankind. And I still have kind of a personal and probably even a scientific problem with that. If we could somehow make the right reinforcements for upstanding, where you're getting it into people's heads, this is not hurting somebody. If I'm close to somebody and they're doing things that really make me nervous, and I call for help, it's not the same thing, but if you have somebody who has a really serious addiction problem and you talk to them straight about it and listen, you're not going to want to hear this, but I'm telling you anyway. And you may not like me for this, but I'm telling you anyway. Mm-hmm. So listen, and you
right.
I don't know how you make that more okay, but for all the people out there that need, they need some kind of carrot to do something more. What are the carrots that will work?
Right.
I don't. It's sad that we need them. I hope I never get to that point. I mean, when I've kind of thought about my own betterment, I'm like, the carrot for me is I want my work and my kind of life to get more challenging and difficult and risky, and to require that in order to get better, I rise to an occasion that I'm not capable of now. But I don't hear that in mass, and
no,
we've somehow,
that's an intrinsic motivation too. That again, I don't want to get too far off this in terms of they talk about culture. What I think might be driving some of this, but if people are given, if they're just sort of given resources without taking responsibility or having to work for those resources, and they're just sort of handed those resources and they have no responsibility or anything, you're not helping that person necessarily, right? And what you're doing, in my estimation, is you're creating that's a reinforcement in and of itself, right? To have an expectation that, well, I'm entitled to this. And so there's this sort of entitlement mentality, I think, that's developing. And again, I don't know, the research has looked at this, but it needs to, because I think we see it. And I think it speaks to, again, what we're seeing here is this lack of, this sort of malaise around just kind of being that passive bystander that just kind of just says, well, yeah, I'm a little worried about, Johnny, but somebody else will probably take care of that. Somebody else will probably let the authority, somebody else will do this. And, how do you shift that paradigm so that, we have a community that it does take a village here, I think, to approach this problem and solve it. And this village that we currently live in, I think we've got some systemic issues and I don't have the answers on how to fix that.
Yeah, is it that village that would get the guys out of the incels, and they would get, I know it's a very ambitious way to look at it, but would there have to be some kind of big shift to get this kind of stuff to stop?
Are you suggesting that possibly that Matthew Crooks was potentially an incel?
I don't know, but I mean, I'm thinking of the kind of larger pattern that's out there. There's, like Craig had said, and I think you'd mentioned as well, that there's this there's this disaffect, the story that we keep hearing over and over again is it's this 18, 20, 21-year-old, kind of awkward, less socially involved, alienated, younger kind of, from what I've heard of in many cases, almost kind of, possibly on the autism spectrum, not really clearly coming and going from anywhere in particular. And then all of a sudden these things happen. And there's just so much, there's, like you said, there's got to be a cultural component because it's happening more and it's happening here. And there's a way that it seems like it keeps being something like the same story, not exactly. And, there is a base rate, there's this, there's a lot of, alienated, not going anywhere, 20-year-old, awkward, non-dating white guys who don't do any of this stuff. And most of them don't.
Right.
But there's got to be an individual mental health component. I think, Dana, I think you'd mentioned this in the beginning, but this is talked about in a lot of the terrorism literature as well, is that there is a way that the press coverage makes this kind of a good thing. They call them lone wolves, and there's kind of a celebration of it. And in a lot of the guidelines, what they're saying is, stop treating it this way. Call them the assailant, not the lone wolf. And that way of kind of shifting the conversation.
Well, and also when I heard the term lone wolf, the media is making you think that there was only one person that knew, and that it was Matthew acted absolutely alone. But I think that is a conversation we could have right now of like, we talked about who else knew, or people that knew and deliberately looked the other way, or people that encouraged him or had knowledge or assisted even. It's hard for me to think that this isn't a school shooting. I understand how guns can get into schools because there's not security. This was a secured event. Okay. So this begs the question, who else assisted him perhaps? And I don't think that's so far out of reality to consider that someone, this information we don't know yet, but it is something that we should think about because many people.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, look, there's a lot of security experts and former, Secret Service folks who have talked, in mainstream media about just the glaring, omissions of security protocol. Like, I've been on presidential and vice presidential details as a police officer when they've come to, Capital City, for example, where I worked. And I know how the Secret Service operates. I know how they scout locations 2 weeks before, and they clear any of, all this stuff. These protocols are very, they're very sort of, they're checklist based, right? They're very regimented, and there's very strict, tight security. So yeah, that was that's a glaring sort of, there's only two explanations for that. That was serious incompetence on the part of whoever the team lead was for that particular operation, or something else is going on. In other words, there's some outside, intervention or something that led to that security breach to allow this 20-year-old, to get up on a roof on a high position like that, with that clear line of sight. So, I think in probabilities, in terms of when we look at something like that happening by omission or incompetence, I find the probability of that to be quite low. So if the probability is quite low, then I have to then think maybe what else is going on? And I don't know, because I don't think they figured that out yet. But it was, he's if he is that lone shooter, there's some level of sophistication that you would have to do in planning in order to be able to get past security and get a long rifle up on a high position on a roof like that, so close to where a presidential candidate is speaking, right? So Yeah, that doesn't add up to me. If that's my law enforcement background speaking, it just doesn't add up. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, kind of peripherally related. What a lot of the terrorism research emphasizes is that when you're looking at people that get involved in really kind of serious mass casualty events, there's so much rehearsal, organizing, planning, and preparation that goes into it. It's an exhausting process for the individual terrorist, and there's such a level of complexity that it probably is not doable for somebody who's really psychotic. That the kind of person that is obviously incompetent to stand trial, is sitting in jail and talking to themselves. That's not somebody that's going to be able to put together something like that with a level of sophistication. I'm thinking it, in terms of events that happen overseas that are part of terrorist groups. There's other people to assist, but for somebody to do it by themselves, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of commitment and
also he made some statement about, I can't remember the exact statement, but that he was going to be recognized, or he had some thought process that he was going to make it through or live, which, if you think about that, how's that going to work out?
I was thinking back to it. It's kind of a similar dynamic, but you guys remember the Teresa Squilcott case, where she she worked for a government agency, and there was kind of a setup operation where she passed classified information, and she ended up going to prison. And the whole controversy was, essentially that there was a psychologist that was involved in kind of setting up the whole thing. There was a lot of controversy about, was this the wrong thing to do because, it was not nice, something kind of along those lines. But what they talked about in a lot of the writings about that case was that there was a sense of, kind of a need for importance, like a narcissistic kind of need, that this is, I have a sense of wanting to do something great. And, it's something that sometimes I feel like we don't give enough attention to in personnel selection kind of questions, that we have a way of kind of rationalizing some psychological test results, and, kind of, I think sometimes getting a bit pressured to pass along bad applicants rather than saying, that it's, in order to do a job that's like ours or like law enforcement, there does have to be a sense of, I think that I'm capable of doing something to, make things better for others. But there's a big difference in, I want to do it because I want things around me to be better versus I want to be a big shot primarily.
Exactly.
There's a big difference between that. And those are the kind of differentials that I think we know pretty well. There's some of this, it's hard to figure out in advance exactly what people are going to do. But I do think that we have a pretty good grasp on, which diagnostic picture are we really looking at, and, what do we really have to worry about here?
Yeah, so what I think I heard you say is maybe you were suggesting that, I don't know, psychologists perhaps maybe should undergo psychological evaluations before they're licensed. I don't know. We talked about that in one of our other episodes, and there's a number of ethical sort of logistics issues maybe around that, but I do evaluations for, pre-employment evaluations for peace officers regularly. And again, just like with the prediction of violence risk, I think we do an okay job, but we could do a much better job. But we're missing quite a bit. You speak to some of the personality disorder architecture, narcissism, and things like that. The way that we screen in California, we're not using the MCMI-4, so we're not using tests that look more at the personality architecture. We're using tests that look at psychopathology, like the MMPI-3 and such. And while those are good tests, right, they're good, but I see frequently I see these personality disorders coming through, right, that the background maybe hasn't picked up on, they maybe pick up on. And so, and some of the research that I've done that's looked at things like, hypermasculinity and, right-wing authoritarianism, and how do those intersect with, producing a police officer who might not be the best fit for for the job, and we're not necessarily screening for that. So it's an interesting, yeah.
It's hard to pick up on, and there's a way that I'm thinking of the times where somebody will kind of look okay in terms of their test results, but then you talk to others who know them and it's much different. And I've had a number of people that have gone through different kinds of testing say, look, I saw the test coming a mile away. And I'm thinking of like one of the benefits of at least some malingering tests is that they're not face valid. You can't exactly tell where it's going. And in order to head it off, you'd have to be pretty sophisticated, because you would have to recognize, essentially, how much do I disclose to be in the middle? And
exactly,
if you're higher intelligence, you can probably do that. But I'm thinking back to kind of our larger focus of, how to stop these terrible things from happening. And, how do we get good data from people that are reluctant to give it to us? And then is there a way that we can put it together that would add incremental value, so that, maybe there's a whole big group of younger men that we end up getting more involved in their life than was, maybe a lot of them don't end up being shooters, but, maybe there was a lot of them that we stopped because we got it right, and I don't know. I still would like to think that going forward, we can somehow get the trend to stop, because it seems to have been stagnant for the last couple of years now, but that still seems still seems unacceptable.
I think it's the high, per capita. Of industrialized nations, I believe we have sort of the highest number of these mass shootings of any industrialized country on the planet. I don't think there's any other. I mean, there's some countries where, yes, there's the higher rates of violence per capita, but these are third world countries. I'm talking about industrialized, first world countries like the U.S. and Western Europe, Australia, and such.
Yeah, and it's I was thinking also that it's getting different. Overseas, there's I can't remember the name of but there was a terrorist recruiter who was caught and said, the job of a good recruiter for Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, and such is you figure out who wants to be recruited and then you listen. Yeah. That's the whole job. And it's not that you're kind of arm twisting them. You're going to join us or else I'm coming after you. That there's a seductive kind of process. Mm-hmm. You got to find those people, and in the inverse, we have to find those people who are going to be next. I don't know how we do that, but we've got to do that, and we've got to have the knowledge to at least catch some of them before it happens, right?
Well, you just described like a recruiting process, right? Two sides of things, like trying to take someone off the pathway to violence, and then you have the other side of someone identifying some vulnerable individual that you could potentially use in an insidious way to carry out your acts of violence.
I mean, if they can get them further along, we can get them further backwards. Somehow, it's got to be. I mean, somehow people get either self or other talked into these things. Something goes on in their head that makes it okay to go along further, and at a certain point it can't be irreversible. The research that's out there says that at some point there is a commitment, and that they're moving along, and it's very. I'm thinking, Craig, you probably have much stronger expertise than me, but, when you're like in hostage negotiation kind of situations and you're trying to figure out, is there a possibility that rapport can be salvaged? Can we get this person talking again? And, I'm thinking of the times where you're like, I've had questions along those lines, like, do we, is now the time that we go tactical? I've always said, I have no expertise there. This is what I can tell you about whether I think that we can get a dialogue going again, and this is why. But again, peripherally related to that, I think that if we can figure out when things are going south and make, I think, relatively good decisions thereabouts, we've got to be able to somehow do the whole thing in reverse. if there's somebody out there that can get, kind of sympathizers for really kind of extreme causes to go even further, that has to be able to be reverse engineered. We've somehow got to be able to, find people that are sitting at their computer, that are disaffected, that are pissed off at everybody else, and somehow get into that head and slow it down and get them back towards normal. There's got to be a way to do that. And, that's it. It speaks to clinical work, which has, always been a relative strength of psychology. We've somehow got to get that person into the room and, get into that head a little bit, I would think.
Yeah, it's that disaffected piece I really think is key here. In other words, that alienated, disaffected, because, why are they seeking out this new tribe, so to speak, whether it's in a terrorist organization or whatever? It's, they're looking for belongingness to something. And when that's disconnected, when they don't have that, right? And then they lose that sense of hope. They're, in the suicide literature, we call it thwarted belongingness, right? That's one of those variables that can predict, someone's path towards hopelessness. They've been disconnected from the tribe, so to speak. They're isolated. They don't have any connection anymore. Life isn't worth living anymore, right? In a similar way, I think similar mechanisms are happening with, this cohort of young men that we're talking about, that their sense of alienation from society in general is so profound. They're seeking something else to replace that in some way. And so the intervention has to happen right, before or, in the early stages of that when they are converting or, going down this other path. So, that's where we have to, that's where we have to catch it. But that's the rub, right? How do we do it?
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it earlier, but we've got to somehow make it okay for mom to call for help.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, like when I've talked to families about this kind of stuff, it is really painful. It's not the same thing, but like when you talk to families with an addict, and what they often will wrestle with is, this person stealing, they're destroying my home. It's metaphorically on fire, and I want them out, but I don't want them dead. And
right.
And it's an awful dilemma, and there's no win. And I don't want to keep repeating, but somehow it's it's hard to be kind of a whistleblower, upstander. It's painful, and there's not a external reward for that. People, I think it's often kind of seen as you're prying into people's business, and
you're called the snitch, or in a lot of cultures, there's like you're snitching on your family member, especially if you're going out and you're reporting something like this to a law enforcement authority like the FBI or something. And, there's obvious stigma associated with that. And in some cultures, that's absolutely taboo. So we have to, somehow dismantle that as well, that sort of stigma that goes along with the reporting. And that's a hard thing to do too. That's tough.
In my experience working in the psychiatric hospital for suicidal or homicidal patients, and most of the ones that were homicidal were men, young men. The people that had the most difficult time like setting boundaries with these men were the mothers of them. Yeah. And that was a theme, a very specific theme that I have seen and continue to see. And I've had numerous family meetings, but the mother would have such a hard time setting those boundaries or saying no or violating the restraining order. So it's, there's some enabling there. But another theme that I've seen in working in crisis, doing interventions, is that typically the men who were brought in on a 5150 hold for danger to others were also a danger to themselves, meaning they were also suicidal. And I talked about this at the very beginning, but that is a risk factor, being so depressed. And I know that Crooks was Googling, depressive disorders or that information, or, so, potentially there was some depression, or maybe it was severe enough where he lost hope or touch with reality, or you care less when you're depressed. And so in my experience, people that are like being suicidal is a risk factor.
Yeah, and this is an important. So going back to Crooks, when you're talking about him being on that roof there, you understand that he was using a rangefinder prior to all of this, right? A rangefinder is used to identify a target in terms of the distance that you're going to be. You're trying to figure out how far away that is, where that target is. He had to have known there are snipers, right, in opposing areas. So that begs the question: was he suicidal? Because he gets up into this high, this roof. He has to know that he's going to get taken out. I mean, he had to have known that.
That's what I would plan on.
You're not getting out of that alive. You're not getting out of that alive. Okay, right? I mean, that's so that thinking about it that way, it's like,
yeah, that's definitely one. But you would have to have thought about it enough that that you're a risk of dying. And then like a smaller risk of surviving and being.
Unless you're delusional, or, and again, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there was a psychotic process going on or anything like that. But, again, if he was delusional or grandiose, or, and had this distorted perception of like his ability to pull this off, so to speak, and, get away with it and all that, it's like, no, it's possible, but there was nothing in the reports afterwards that suggests that nobody was reporting that he was behaving in a way that suggested he had a formal thought disorder, right? Yes, he was Googling major depressive disorder, but we don't know if I haven't heard about any treatment for any mental illness. I don't know if I haven't heard that, but again, going back to that, when you think of that homicidal suicidal combination, it's like he was using a rangefinder. He had to have seen those snipers, because those snipers were posted up there behind the stage and were doing what they were responsible for an outside perimeter, actually for a distance outside of where Crooks was at. But nonetheless, those snipers have high powered rifles with very high quality scopes that he had to have seen from his position.
And I understand he went there the day before to scout it out. Yeah. So,
Yeah. Well, interesting.
Yeah. I read about things that I'm thinking, I can't think of other specific cases, but, where they would, after the fact, they would look through backpacks and find drawings and, diagrams and plans. And, it's like this was not an impulsive kind of thing. This was figured out well in advance. And I mean, it's an interesting point you make there about the, that there didn't seem to be a real clear exit. I'm thinking of, like the Parkland shooting, where if you look at the whole thing, where was the exit plan really?
Yeah, he didn't have one here because the entire perimeter is essentially secure, right? I mean, again, I don't know. It baffles me. I don't understand how he was able to get a rifle up on that roof in the first place, but I mean, he obviously did. So, but you're right. There's like, okay, if there's no exit plan, if you're not getting out of this alive, you start taking shots at the former president, right, from a high position like that. High probability you're going to get taken out. I mean, he had to have contemplated this, right? Like it's.
Well, let's consider that someone had led him to believe he had an exit strategy.
Possible.
In
other words,
it could have been,
yeah, right.
Right. I mean, they could have lied or manipulated to him, right? Like there is no exit strategy, but led him to believe they were going to assist afterwards. Like, I mean, we could speculate a lot of things, but these are the things that go through my mind. But I will be looking forward to finding out more. And any final thoughts or comments?
No, I'm still like you said, Dane. I still have a lot swimming through my own head, but I don't know. I hope we come up with the kind of bigger plan here. That at the next APA conventions and what have you, that there's some grand addition to our mission that says, this is going to be our call to action. We are going to somehow, maybe we can't totally stop this, but we're not having another 600 year. And, there are a lot of contributing factors to this that we can do something about. Even if we can't predict what everybody's going to do all the time, there's probably a lot more that we can do than we can't do. And this can't be as good as it gets. It can't be that this is just an irreversible trend. And I don't know. We eggheads have got to. This has got to be partially on us. I think we've got to figure something out here.
I have a great idea. We can collaborate. Let's get a hold of the APA and let's do a talk next year at the convention.
Yeah. Saying, what's, is this? Go ahead. Sorry, Craig.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, it's like, like you said, it starts oftentimes with a grassroots, calling, right? Where, but and then we get an organization like the APA involved. Maybe they form a committee and that kind of thing, and we start looking at the research. We start looking at where are the gaps, because clearly there's gaps in the research. I don't think we fully understand. We've talked a lot about, I think, what variables are at play here, but how do we know for certain if we don't have the empirical support in the research to back that up? In other words, that grounded research that we really need. And I don't know that we have a good enough grasp yet on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's it would be very ambitious and very logistically difficult to pull off, but it would be great if there was some way that we could have a research team and the end includes Dylann Roof, Nicholas Cruz, and the research question is, why'd you do it? And you get enough of them to have kind of a grounded theory, where you can kind of put things together and say, look, these aren't exactly the most reliable, all these people may or may not be being truthful with us. They may not be totally capable of going back into the moment and figuring out, exactly when did I jump off the cliff?
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you have somebody in a hospital and you say, why, what do you need to do to stay out of here? You're asking somebody to put together a really complicated picture in a really difficult part, and they're in an existential kind of crisis. And but at the same time, I would like to think that if we could somehow get better information, from it would be retrospectively, but the why did you do it? That would give us something more to go. I don't know how you do that logistically, but that would give us something.
Well, the FBI's done it. The FBI has done it. That's where the behavioral analysis unit was started. That's exactly what they did. They looked retrospectively. They with regard to serial killers. So serial killers, different population, but this is where profiling came from. And I know profiling is not an exact science, but they did. They looked at all these serial killers. They interviewed them over a number of years, and then they developed that that database that they actually use to profile. That's why when you get the profile of a suspected serial killer, they have some of these demographic characteristics and things that turn out to be rather accurate predictors. Not all of them are, but I think a similar model could be built, using these mass shooters, these school shooters, and this subpopulation that we're talking about. We kind of know who the population is. I mean, this is not 35-year-old women doing this, right? I mean, we know. Yeah. We've got that part down. So, I think, again, this does require a concerted effort, and, would be quite rigorous research. I mean, it's more ambitious than what I could probably undertake right now at the university where I teach at. But I don't know. I have a few students that are pretty ambitious. So maybe I can rally them and see what we can start to put together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation. I know I would love to have you back on, Dr. Danzer. You have a wealth of information and you're well researched. I know we initially connected on LinkedIn and the topic on psychopaths, and we'll have to do another podcast session on that alone.
Yeah.
But
yeah, definitely.
Where can people find you if they want to hire you or connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm happy to chat. I'm on ResearchGate as well. And if you add me, I'll say yes, and let's talk.
Okay, awesome. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening, Killer Psychologist. For episode details and merch, check out killerpsychologistpodcast.com. And for forensic services, you can book online at psychologydr.com. That's psychologydoctor.com.